This UCSD TV program is a presentation of University of California Television for educational and non-commercial use only.
I've been instructed to give a non-technical talk, and in this talk I'm going to be explaining behaviors that obey the Golden Rule, not the Golden Rule itself. And in doing so, I'll be making some points extremely briefly, which I wrote out in this book, this little book a few years ago, The Neuroscience of Fair Play. Here's the problem. A few years ago, actually January of 2006, in New York City, a few months before I wrote this book, a guy was standing, Wesley Autry, was standing on a platform, a subway train platform in New York City, and the person next to him had an epileptic seizure and fell onto the tracks, and a train was coming. Wesley Autry jumped down onto the tracks and pressed both of them onto the tracks such that the train could pass over, and in fact it was so close that lubrication oil was then having to be wiped off from the engine, was having to be wiped off of Autry's head. Now why did he do that? He was not of the same racial background as the guy he saved, and in fact when he jumped onto the tracks he left his own young son up on the platform. And so my job over the next few minutes will be to talk about brain mechanisms that would allow a human being to do that. I'm proposing that human behaviors obeying an ethical universal, I'll claim that the Golden Rule is at least widespread, can be explained by neuroscientists, and I'll put forward a parsimonious theory to do so. In other words, I'm not going to make special assumptions. I'll be treating an ethical universal, or at least the widespread rule, the Golden Rule, as a natural scientific phenomenon. So as your eyes are skimming down these quotes, I'll tell you that many, many years ago, I spent a lot of time in the history of religion section of a college library. And if you'll permit a double negative, I couldn't find any religion that did not have some kind of statement, a Golden Rule type of statement. And so what you have here is Confucius, you have Christianity, you have Islam, and it doesn't take a religious point of view in order to say something like this, because here you have Immanuel Kant's categorical imperative, which is a philosophical statement and not a religious statement. So I was encouraged to think of Golden Rule-like behavior as something that might have a biological basis and that I, as a neuroscientist, might be able to explain it. I got further inspiration, I was doing this a long time ago, I got further inspiration from Axelrod at the University of Michigan and Hamilton. They showed in their science article that even computers can be programmed to exhibit reciprocity in their behaviors. There's nothing magical about the mechanisms proposed in the book whose title I showed you. And what Axelrod and Hamilton did, this is the famous W.D. Hamilton, was to hold a tournament among computer programs using the game Prisoner's Dilemma, which I'll show you in a minute. But the take-home line is that a simple two-step program won the tournament. Step one, cooperate with the other computer, and step two, do what the other computer did on the previous step. And the Prisoner's Dilemma, as you probably know, at least some of you will know, works like this. Prisoner B and prisoner A have committed a crime, and the authorities are trying to get them to defect. In other words, they want B to defect and tell on A, in which case B gets a high payoff, the way the game is set up. And they also try to get A to defect and squeal on them both, in which case A gets a high payoff. But the fact is that neither A nor B know what the other one is going to do. And so the way the game is set up is that cooperation gets the highest total score. So what I figured was that if a rule that humans seem to behave, or at least they're told to behave, in virtually all the cultures that I could read about, and is likely to have a biological basis. And if it's even computable, then I, as a neuroscientist, and thinking about this in my spare time, might be able to explain it. So the main purpose of today's talk is to put forward this parsimonious scientific theory, which I'll explain in the simplest possible way, and how we manage to behave according to the Golden Rule. What I won't be able to do today is honestly to envision the balance between CNS mechanisms for altruism and those for aggression. That's in the book, and we'll talk about that in more technical terms tomorrow. So how does this work? It's a four-step theory. Step one is represent one's impending actions to oneself. And it turns out that this step one is grounded in classical neurophysiology, and I'll give you a pictorial example. Suppose you're looking at a scene and you move your eyeball to the right. The main question is, when you move your eyeball to the right, does the world appear to move to the left? And the answer is obviously no, and the question is why? The reason is that as you move your eyeball to the right, the oculomotor system sends a command signal to the visual system, and this command signal is called corollary discharge. If the main discharge moves the eyeball, the corollary discharge is the one informing the sensory system involved that something's going to happen. Thus, we expect the world to move in a certain way when we make a carefully calculated eye movement, which is registered in corollary discharge, and it accounts for the stability of the visual world. That's ray ofference theory, and that's at least 50 years old. To the earliest demonstrations of corollary discharge, which I just talked about, those involving the oculomotor system, have been added many studies involving other types of movements. If you'll permit me a motor physiologist's view of the embodied mind, quotes, the embodied mind, you'd say that, quotes, we are the individuals whose movements we can predict. So the current theory, which I'm talking about today, simply extends that classical ray ofference theory that I told you about to social acts with an ethical import. So that's step one. Represent your own the movement you're about to make to your own sensory surfaces or your own sensory physiology. Step two is to envision the target of one's social action that has moral import. And this, again, is grounded in solid neurophysiology. The first person to record face neurons in the inferotemporal cortex of the monkey was Charlie Gross, Bob DeSimone and Charlie Gross at Princeton University. And they used electrophysiological techniques, but Nancy Kanwisher at MIT used imaging techniques. And they and many people since then have defined the face areas, for example, in the inferotemporal cortex. And they show how these neurons can respond specifically to faces. So imaging the target of your action is no problem. But now we get to the main point. This is the gimmick. It's to blur, or we could say merge, or we could say have cross-excitation between the target's image with one's own image. And it turns out that with known neurochemistry, this, again, is easy to imagine how it's done, although it's never been directly demonstrated in the context that I'm speaking about today. And I'll give you three examples. The first is simply, and I've talked about this with Nancy Kanwisher to make sure that I'm not a cortical physiologist, and so I wanted to make sure that I was barking up the right tree. First easy way to decrease the performance, that's what we're asking for, is the decrease of performance of sensory physiological systems, is to add noise to cerebral cortical activity. One way of doing it is to block inhibitory synapses, block GABA synapses. A second way of doing it is to construct gap junctions, which are tiny tunnels between nerve cells, and allow charged particles to go from nerve cell A to nerve cell B, thus accounting for a spread of excitation, thus allowing the blurring of perceptual images. A third thing is to play games with cholinergic inputs. The same cholinergic neurons that in your basal forebrain you're maintaining carefully because you don't want to get Alzheimer's disease have incredibly complex physiologic effects in at least 2 layers of the cerebral cortex and can ramp up and ramp down the sensitivity of those cortical mechanisms extremely easily. So that's one way. A second way of decreasing perceptual clarity, that is to merge one's image with the image of the object of one's actions, is to alter timing. This was Nancy Kanwisher's idea. Altering timing in these systems completely screws up performance. A third thing that you might have heard about, a third mechanism, is mirror neurons. This was discovered in the laboratory of Giovanni Rizzolatti in the University of Padua, Italy. And what it was is that they were recording from a monkey's neuron in the premotor cortex that responded when the monkey moved his hand like that. And during lunch, when one of the experimenters was holding a cup of coffee, the neuron on the other side of the room began to fire. The monkey was treating the other person's action, the experimenter's action, as his own, merging the image of the other with his own. I think this is awfully easy, at least theoretically. And I can ask the metaphorical question, if we're talking about a computational device in the brain, is it simpler to improve a computer's performance or to break it? And step 4 is decide. If, as a result of the first 3 steps, you see that this is a good action toward the other, it would be a good action toward yourself, then you do it, and if it isn't, then you wouldn't. My assistant is a professional artist, and so I can indulge in a brief cartoon before finishing up. This little guy with the gun has already represented the impending action to himself, namely shooting this big fellow. Notice their hair and notice their shirts. Now he's going to envision the target of his action and the result of shooting the fellow, blood pouring out. And now, if you notice the hair and the shirt, we're going to merge the images. And at step 4, the decision, we're going to do what no American male does between west of the Appalachians or east of the Rockies, which is to throw away his gun. So in finishing up, I'll just ask, is this an elegant theory? An elegant theory is one that gets a lot of implications with having very little special assumptions. In this case, no special abilities are presupposed. Richard Dawkins would be very pleased. Secondly, it's easier to make a mechanism work lousy than it is to make it work better. We're asking for a blurring of perceptual images, not a sharpening of them. Thirdly, as I illustrated just thinking about the current literature, actually the older literature, there are many, many ways to throw off cortical perceptual function. And here's the key thing, is that all of these can work. They're not all of those possibilities that I talked about are not mutually exclusive of each other, and they could work with different strengths in different individuals. So there's a tremendous amount of flexibility and therefore robustness with the theoretical output of this theory. So to keep within time, I'll finish up by leaving you with the little red man. In this artistic depiction, this little red man's feet is touching the earth and the hands are supporting the sky. And so I attended a gallery opening with the contemporary Chinese artist Liu Shengzhong, and quoting from Liu, similar forms can be found in early civilizations from many parts of the world. As the earliest self-portrait and the earliest evidence of self-awareness, the shape illustrates congruities among early civilizations. He's talking in artistic terms about the same thing as we're trying to talk about in proto-scientific terms. Our theory, our neuroscientific theory, makes use of self-awareness merged with other awareness to explain behavior that obeys an ethical universal. Thank you.
Compared to our nearest ape relations, humans are particularly other-regarding, not necessarily uniquely eager to share, but extremely eager to share and to cooperate, even with non-kin. Spontaneous helping and voluntary gift-giving are documented for every human society ever studied. Even quite young children will pick out something that they have reason to think someone else will particularly enjoy and spontaneously offer it. Nevertheless, as Christophe just explained, there are conditions, and it may depend on which computer you use, but there are conditions when chimpanzees as well do help one another. For example, common chimpanzees sharing some meat, or a bonobo female allowing some other infant to remove some food from her mouth. But these tend to be preceded by begging. and often more nearly illustrate scrounging than the spontaneous and considered gift-giving that we see in humans. When combined with intention reading, which is not unique to humans, but very well elaborated in humans, these other regarding impulses equip humans to coordinate with others to achieve common goals, as in the case of these Kayapo tribesmen, and they've waded into the water and they're beating this timbo plant with sticks, nothing here beyond Stone Age technology. They're releasing a toxin into the water so that women and children can come around with baskets in the shallow water and gather up the stunned fish. A tremendously valuable protein resource not available to other apes. So why haven't other apes gone this route? In one of the more ambitious efforts to try to understand exactly where the differences lie, Mike Tomasello's team at Leipzig have designed a special battery of sociocognitive tests, and they've compared 105 human children, 2.5 years old, 106 chimpanzees, 32 orangutans, and just in light of what Christophe just said, I actually agree with his criticisms, but I cite these studies because they're the best we have. They are captive animals, yes indeed. What they found was that in the realm of spatial cognition, remarkably similar capacities, quantities, assessing many versus few, very similar causality. What happens when I push this with a stick? It falls over. Very similar. Where these creatures differed was in terms of social learning, watching a demonstrator solve a problem and then doing it the same way, communication, reading where I'm pointing, and what psychologists call theory of mind, attributing a mental state to others. Now look, it's not that chimpanzees and orangutans don't have these capacities, indeed they exhibit them, it's that humans are better at them. Okay, why? Well, I used to think, oh sure, I know. It's because we've got these brains 3 times bigger than a chimpanzee's or an Australopithecine, brains capable of symbolic thought and language. And then, you know, I started to learn a little bit more about it, read people like Peter Hobson convincing me, whoa, before language there had to have been something else, something that propelled us into language, something that could evolve in tiny steps, that could make one person want to join up their mind with someone else. There had to be these emotional links first. I also assume, you know, we have these special capacities. Andy Meltzoff showed us that right from birth, little babies can imitate someone else's facial expressions, this empathy and imitation going on. Oh, sure, that's the answer. We're wired differently. And of course, now we know that, you know, other chimps as well, right from birth. The wiring is there. Something else is going on. And one of the differences seems to be that little humans get more and more interested in this stuff as time goes by, so that by 9 months, for example, a baby will hold something out, an object, and want to know what someone else is thinking about this object. And little chimpanzees don't do this. Well, previous efforts, in fact, you've heard some today, to explain our peculiarly pro-social capacities in humans have focused on selection pressures on males to cooperate in hunting or intergroup conflict and so forth. Yet think about it. The differences are found in both sexes and emerged very early in development. And this is one reason my attention has been drawn to the very different rearing environments of humans and other apes. In all apes, mothers are very possessive of new babies, in all the non-human apes, and they are their sole source of nutrition, warmth, locomotion, security. This mother chimpanzee is not going to let that baby out of her touch for one moment, day or night, for the first 6 months of life. Thereafter, she's going to go on nursing for up to 5 years. by contrast, women in foraging societies, wherever they have been studied, exhibit a remarkable maternal tolerance just postpartum to other people handling their babies. San and Hadza babies, for example, are going to be held by allo mothers 25 to 30% of the time, right from birth onward. This baby has just been handed over to his grandmother, and she's massaging the scalp. This FA infant in Central Africa is going to spend 60% of daytime being held by allo mothers, which is not to say mothers aren't important. Babies spend the night with their mothers. They're centrally important, the main attachment figure. The point is, unlike other great apes, we are sharing infants with others. Who are these group members other than the mother, the allo mothers helping to care for babies? Well, they're mostly relatives, fathers, brothers, cousins, the male allo mothers. The female allo mothers are mostly sisters, aunts, and grandmothers. Why do we need all this help? Well, other apes, once weaned, provision themselves. But human children are going to remain dependent on nutritional subsidies from others for years. If you think it's unusual that your 20-year-old is still at home, it's not. It takes 10 to 13 million calories beyond what a child provides himself to rear a human from birth to age 18, far more than a foraging mom could provide herself. And there's going to be a new baby before the older children are mature because interbirth intervals in hunter-gatherers tend to be shorter than in other apes. Well, how was this possible? It used to be assumed that, oh, sure, let's father the hunter. He provisioned his mate, her offspring, in line with a sex contract, guaranteeing him certainty of paternity. This is why humans became bipedal, so he could bring the meat back. Well, the problem is work by James O'Connell, Kristen Hawkes, Kaplan, Hill, others. The rates of success among hunters with Pleistocene tools at their disposal would be too variable to provide for children who have to eat several times a day. As you heard earlier today, maybe 5 hunters, more than one for sure, and they need to share. And as Chris Baum pointed out, that sharing can often be pressure from below. Don't be stingy or you'll be ostracized. As hominins included more meat in their diet, it would require multiple hunters, and who would pool and redistribute it, but you also need women gathering plant foods that's more reliably provided. So you need this division of labor coming back to a central camp. Well, in line with what people like Kristen Hawkes have been arguing for some time, about 60% of the calories in, whether you're looking at San, Bushman, or at Hadza, are due to plant foods brought in by women, and about 40% from meat and honey from men. And whereas mothers with new babies are actually bringing in less food, much more than they're consuming is being brought in by these post-reproductive women. Hawkes has called them the hardworking Hadza grandmothers, but in fact, they don't necessarily have to be grandmothers. This is a great aunt pulling aside an enormous boulder to get at the tubers underneath. These post-reproductive allo mothers are bringing in up to 3,500 calories a day. Okay, so in order for this kind of system to work, and it's what sociobiologists have called cooperative breeding, that is any species where allo-parents, group members other than parents in addition to parents, help to both care for and provision young. In order for this to work, you have to have quite flexible residence patterns. And you have to have people being able to move between groups, gravitating away from adversity towards opportunity, where opportunities are not just access to food and water, but access to kin who will help you, even non-kin who might help you. There's a lot of what Randy would call social selection going on in residence choices. You can have a grandmother moving to another group to live near the daughter who needs her most because she's got a stepfather instead of a father in residence. a typical hunter-gatherer pattern is for a young man to come live with his wife for a time, hunting on her family's behalf before children are born, so that she's got kin there when her first offspring arrives. A very vulnerable time across all primates. First births, vulnerable for the mother, especially vulnerable for the infants. So a lot of alloparental assistance going on. Well, some of you may still be wondering, why would anyone help? And I think that we've already heard today about Hamilton's rule, and I agree completely with Christoph's point. It's not just about kin selection. It's why I prefer calling it Hamilton's rule, but there are these other factors involved, so that, for example, if a male is very well fed, the cost of helping somebody else is low. If he might be the father, doesn't know for sure he is, he's still going to stuff food in the mouths of these little chicks. But what's interesting is that if over time it's been advantageous to help someone else's young, the threshold for responding to cues like a gaping mouth goes down, so that you can have mistakes, like this cardinal stuffing food into the mouth of a gaping goldfish. And it turns out that in highly social species with particularly helpless young, other group members are especially susceptible to enticing cues from baby. This is my neighbor's Jack Russell Terrier, who chased away a very surprised mother cat, began to spontaneously lactate, adopted her kittens, and reared them. This happens in non-human primates as well. This is a Cebus monkey who adopted and nursed a baby marmoset that she found abandoned in the woods. These misdirected parental care examples happen. Well, our species, humans, is wide open to babies as sensory traps. And this is well known to Madison Avenue, well known to filmmakers. Some of you may have seen the recent blockbuster film, Babies. Look at the film, but then turn around and look at the audience. They're all just agog. No wonder. We know that the orbitofrontal cortex and the regions of the brain that are set up for rewarding us when we see something we like light up when people look at babies, and it is true for both parents and non-parents, for males as well as females. So even though in other apes, infants are cared for exclusively by mothers, across the animal kingdom, cooperative breeding has evolved many times. We don't need to talk about how special humans are to explain it. It's found among social insects, 9% of 10,000 species of birds, maybe 3% of 5,400 species of mammals. It's especially likely to evolve in the social carnivores and in non-human primates, and human ones too, I'm about to argue. Allomaternal care of infants is found in over half of all the 300 to 400 species of primates that are out there. Shared care and at least minimal provisioning is found in perhaps a quarter of these species. However, only in humans and in the subfamily Callitrichidae, that's marmosets and tamarins, do you have full-fledged cooperative breeding. That is alloparental care plus extensive alloparental provisioning. And what's interesting is that many of the conditions that predispose other animals to evolve cooperative breeding pertained among our ancestors. Obviously, very social groups, benefits to group membership, benefits to philopatry, benefits to sticking around and being exposed to those enticing cues from babies that are dependent for a long time. Animals with combined foraging techniques, hunting and extractive foraging, bringing food back to a central place where it can be shared, which probably our ancestors have been doing since perhaps 1.8 million years ago, Homo erectus. And Also, temporal variability in rainfall and eco-instability. This is just a chart from Rick Potts's work at Lake Orlogasali in the Rift Valley, where one of the sites our hominin ancestors used, showing that the period between 1 million and 600,000 years ago, tremendous variation in rainfall as that lake goes from shallow to deep to shallow. Recently, ornithologists have shown that seasonal variability in rainfall is especially associated with the evolution of cooperative breeding in birds. Just a quick mention of these marmosets and tamarins. Like humans, these guys, they're very excellent colonizers. And one of the things about cooperative breeding is that when times are good, they can speed up breeding, but when times are bad, they can manage to hang on. And one of the things I would suspect is that the name of the game among our ancestors, with very high rates of child mortality, very hard time really making it in Pleistocene Africa, was that the name of the game was not so much mating success as success keeping at least some offspring alive, assuring the proper component in your group of effective hunters and motivated gatherers. These marmosets also have unusually developed other regarding impulses. This is true among wild marmosets, where other group members, not necessarily related to the infants, but sometimes related to the infants, provide about 90% of the food in some species for just weaned infants, and in the lab as well. Christoph cited that study of chimpanzees in captivity showing very little other regarding impulses. Under similar experimental conditions, captive marmosets show unusually other regarding impulses. Great deal of concern for the well-being of others. I don't have time to talk more about them today. What I want to turn to now, though, is what can we say about the psychological implications of cooperative breeding for little apes reared in what for an ape would have been a completely novel social context? Well, we don't have a time machine to go back and see, but we can study their still extant human descendants, among whom psychologists document that babies off their mothers spend more time looking at faces, monitoring eye gaze, and so forth than when they are in physical contact with her. And even without taking evolutionary considerations into account, we know from psychological studies of infants in Western societies that the presence of a maternal grandmother is correlated with increased mother's sensitivity to her baby, more secure mother-infant attachment, enhanced cognitive ability by age 4, presence of older siblings correlated with more sophisticated theory of mind, multiple caretakers correlated with enhanced capacity to integrate multiple perspectives. Also, we find in our species an unusual ability, even in very young children, to assess the motives of others. Infants shown a cartoon of a yellow square helping the little red ball get up, and a nasty blue square pushing the little red ball down. Afterwards, the children will reach out preferentially to the helpful symbol. Figure out reputation there. So I want you to join me in a thought experiment. Take a highly intelligent bipedal primate with the cognitive and the manipulative potentials, the rudimentary empathy and theory of mind found in all great apes, then rear that ape in a novel developmental context where maternal care is contingent and the infant depends on care and provisioning from multiple caretakers. Subject this novel phenotype to novel selection pressures such that infants best at mind reading and best cared for are also going to be the best fed, most likely to survive. What do you get? In high child mortality environments, you get directional selection favoring just the traits: enhanced mutual tolerance, social learning, social communication, perspective taking, that comparisons with other apes require us to explain. So what I'm suggesting is that long before behaviorally modern humans with symbolic thought and language and before the evolution of big-brained, anatomically modern humans, you have the emergence of emotionally modern humans already questing for intersubjective engagement with others. What you have as a byproduct then are the precursors, the building blocks for some of the later developments that you're going to be hearing more about today. So what I've been talking about is simply the prequel to the main human feature film, but some very important building blocks for the kind of social selection that Hrdy, for example, is talking about when he's saying, how do we explain the peculiarly other regarding impulses that we find in humans that possibly emerge from social selection. You need these building blocks first. Thanks.
So what I want to talk to you today about is what I call, Rob Boyd, my longtime co-author, and I call the tribal social instincts hypothesis to explain human cooperation. So this is a particular proposal. It's a little bit Baroque. There are a bunch of pieces, moving parts here, but maybe that's reasonable for a complicated organism, and it follows up on Patricia's remark that culture perhaps plays an important role in the evolution of human capacities to form large societies, to cooperate, to engage in altruistic behaviors. So the argument here is as follows. I'm going to argue that cultural evolution is a Darwinian process, so that culture is a system that evolves in its own right. It's a little bit like the genetic inheritance system, but it's a little bit different, and interesting things happen, particularly because of the differences. And then that genes and culture co-evolve, that the evolution of these two processes influence one another, that we're bound up, our phenotype is bound up proximally in genetic and cultural causes, and that over evolutionary time, these two evolutionary processes interact in strong ways. It's not something, they can't be dissected apart, and they don't operate in isolation. I'm going to argue that cultural evolution is faster than genetic evolution, that's really what it's for, is a system of adaptation to attract rapidly changing environmental processes, and that as a consequence of that, it's going to tend to be the leading process in this coevolutionary process. First, culture is going to change, and then genes are going to change in response, so that the genes are kind of in the driver's seat, at least late in human evolution. And obviously, as humans became more and more cultural over the last few million years, the tendency for culture to have a big and leading impact will have increased. And I don't want to get into too much of a debate about the exact time scales here, but I'll try to convince you that at least that this is a plausible thing to have happened. So the idea then that in the Pleistocene, humans were selected at the level of groups based on cultural variations, and then that elements of our social psychology co-evolved to produce docility and prosociality. We've just heard about, in the last couple of talks, about the proximal mechanisms by which these kinds of things can be implemented. That doesn't seem to be, at least in principle, a big problem. So the idea that cultural evolution is Darwinian, this was appreciated by Darwin and students of linguistic history way back in the 19th century. Both languages and organic forms seem to evolve by the descent with modification. And this idea didn't do very much work until the last quarter of the 20th century or so, when a number of us got interested in trying to study formally the cultural system of inheritance as an inheritance system, and try to draw out the evolutionary implications of it. And as I already mentioned, cultural evolution is rapid. It's rapid because cultural evolution doesn't depend just upon random variation and natural selection to provide the main motor of evolution. The cultural system of inheritance is coupled to our decision-making capacities. To some extent, we can pick and choose amongst what cultural items we borrow from other people. We can try to figure out what's successful and borrow that differentially. We can sometimes invent things through processes of individual learning that are better than random variation. And so these decision-making forces tend to make cultural evolution faster than genetic evolution. And we have an idea about why the climate variation in the Pleistocene is the original motor that drove the evolution of cultural capacities in humans. There are a bunch of other differences between the cultural inheritance system of humans and the genetic system of inheritance. Or capacity for more than two parents. We're sort of polysexual, right? We can make cultural love to most anybody we take a fancy to. And we can have lots of cultural lovers where children can only have two parents. So there's by now a fairly well-developed theory that's derived from these kinds of considerations, and I don't have time to do more than give that brief summary. Now, the idea that genes and culture co-evolve, for a long time, our best example of this, or one of our best examples, was adult lactose absorption. Maybe many of you know this story. So in most humans, like most animals, about the time of the age of weaning, we stop secreting lactase in our gut because lactose, milk sugar, is what babies have from their mother. It's an important source of calories in mammalian milk, and once we're weaned, we have no more use for that enzyme. Now, in a few human populations, Northwest Europeans, for example, and some dairying populations in Africa, cattle-keeping populations in Africa, people do drink a lot of fluid milk, and they have evolved adult lactase secretion. So there's and presumably the business of dairying came first, and then people kept cows and managed somehow to use milk, and then they weren't getting the advantage of the milk sugar calories out of the milk, and so there was selection pressure for humans to evolve adult lactase secretion. It's an easy thing to evolve. The regulatory enzyme is just broken. It's broken in two different ways, one way in Africans and one way in Northwest Europeans, at least two ways. There may be more. Then there are these, in this diagram here, up in the upper right, are the percent lactose absorbers as a function of whether the population is dairying or not. The number 2 up there are Northwest Europeans. Number 1 down there, East Asians, a whole collection of people, Africans who don't have dairying and have low percentage of lactose absorbance as adults. And then there are these intermediate populations, typically that make use of milk products that, like yogurt, where the lactose is fermented by bacteria rather than in the human gut. So the intermediate populations there give us a picture of how this might have evolved. That people started with those kinds of products, milk products, and then the ability to digest lactose evolved more or less gradually. So this is a case where agriculture, dairying, cattle keeping came and drove the evolution of a dietary adaptation to this cultural practice. Now it seems, on some recent evidence at least, that this is just a tip of a great big iceberg. So this is some data reviewed by John Hawkes and co-authors in PNAS a few years ago that shows a huge wave of selected variants that occurred apparently in the aftermath of agriculture. Some of these are also classic variants like resistance to various kinds of alleles for resistance to malaria, which we also think is very recent and grew up with the expansion of human populations under agriculture to process. When human populations became numerous, then we acquired many epidemic diseases, and therefore we acquired things like sickle cell and for resistance to malaria, and many other alleles for resistance to malaria, and probably lots of other things. So most of these dots in this diagram diagram that suggests that there's this big wave of response to selection in Africa and Europe just after the evolution of agriculture. Most of the functional significance of those is dimly understood, so we still don't know what most of that's all about. And in fact, there's some considerable controversy about whether the techniques for detecting these selective sweeps are as yet very accurate, or whether selective sweeps are the main kind of response. But at least there's a strong suggestion here that in the case of the origins of agriculture, there was a huge wave of coevolutionary response to this cultural change. So we have some kind of confidence that this kind of process can work. And the question is, did it happen further back in human evolution to derive the evolution of, for want of a better word, our social instincts, the innate components of our social psychology, our docility and other features that make our ability to run these cooperative societies possible. So Rob's and my argument is that humans are susceptible to, uniquely susceptible to group selection. Maybe unique is too strong a word. That the cultural variation that is so predominant in our species is more susceptible to group selection than is the case for genes. This is a famous quote from the Descent of Man, where Darwin argues that the selection of tribe against tribe would lead to the evolution of fidelity, obedience, courage, sympathy, patriotism, and these virtues that make social life possible, and that this would be a form of natural selection, he said. So he was treating this as a special case. Darwin wasn't a wholesale group selectionist at all, and but he didn't really put his finger, I don't think, on why humans are a special case. So why is it that cultural evolution might be susceptible to group selection, more susceptible than is the case of genes? So as I mentioned, Rob and I think that culture originally rose as an adaptation to Pleistocene climatic chaos. So I don't know if you follow this, but in the last glacial there were these huge variations in climate, and it turns out that these have apparently been ramping up over the last few glacial cycles. So humans and other animals have been getting bigger brains over this period of time, and so organisms in general have been under pressure to adapt to more variable environments. And in the case of humans, this took the form of using this faster system of inheritance to track these environmental variations, so that our advantage relative to other animals is that we can deploy culture to evolve adaptations to ephemeral kinds of environmental variations, or resist better the catastrophes that ensue when the environment changes regularly, or excuse me, changes at high amplitude and irregularly. Now, there are features of the cultural system that predispose this variation to group selection. First is just the rapidity of it itself. So two isolated or semi-isolated human populations will tend to diverge faster than two other animals' populations, or for that matter, the human cultural variation will diverge faster than our genetic variation. There's also this problem or this interesting feature that social games often have multiple equilibria. So two separated populations are likely to get, if there are coordination equilibria, driving on the left-hand side of the road versus the right-hand side of the road, separate populations will get on different equilibria, and then it'll be hard for them to get off of these equilibria. So social interactions will tend to stabilize equilibria. We've studied a process we call conformist transmission. If you tend to imitate the common type in your population, there are good adaptive reasons for supposing you might often want to do this. That discriminates against migrants or other rare types that in the population. It tends to stabilize whatever cultural feature becomes common in a particular group. So this is an engine for protecting groups from the effects of cultural effects of migration and preserving variation between groups. So the whole problem of group selection is preserving variation between groups. A little bit of genetic migration goes a long way toward dissolving the variation between groups. And so the question is, can cultural evolution preserve more variation? Success and prestige biases can generate variation between groups. So prestige has a runaway process, for example, so that we can get groups diverging as prestige criteria diverge. Punishment is powerful. We've already heard about the importance of punishment for punishing cheaters. But aside from punishing cheaters, punishment mechanisms have a tendency to stabilize anything. So Rob and I have an old paper in which we argue that punishment will stabilize cooperation or anything else. If we have moralistic punishment, if most of us are willing to punish people who don't wear ties to meetings like this, which would have obtained a couple of generations ago, we'd all been wearing, all the men would have been wearing ties. A few of them still are, not many. We won that battle. But so you could stabilize any silly thing, right? If the majority of people are willing to punish people for doing any silly thing, then that will stabilize that silly thing, or maybe not so silly things. So again, it's a process for generating and maintaining variation between groups. We mark the boundaries of groups symbolically. So we may define in-groups and out-groups in terms of things like dialect and dress and other things. And that has a tendency to retard the migration of cultural variance across these groups. And then all these things tend to lead to the evolution of what sociologists and some economists and political scientists call institutions. They're characteristic forms of social organization that everyone or most people at least in a social system conform to, because there are sanctions for not conforming to them and rewards for conforming to them. So much of our social life is organized around institutions, and these are really just characteristic of the different societies. So it's almost as if humans are different species in terms of their social organization as far as institutions are concerned. We have one kind, somebody else has another kind, and even if individuals migrate back and forth, they'll tend to conform to the institutions of the host society that they migrate into. Their genes will come, but their culture will tend not to. And then secondarily, genes adapted to life in tribes by this process of gene-culture coevolution. That's our argument. It's certainly true, I think, that anthropologists have told us since forever that humans are hugely variable culturally. So, but anthropologists, for the most part, haven't been interested in putting numbers on things, and people like me are really interested in putting numbers on things. So this is an attempt to put numbers on the genetic variation between human groups compared to the cultural variation between human groups. So Adrian Bell, a student of ours at Davis, got together the data from the World Values Survey. That's the gray bars there, representing probably mostly cultural variation. The dark bars are from Cavalli-Sforza and Feldman's classic, Cavalli-Sforza and co-authors, not Feldman, treatise on human genetic variation. So these are neighboring groups. So what would be relevant for group selection would be neighboring groups. So this is and we use the same statistic to analyze both sets of data, FST, the proportion of variation between groups relative to the total variation. And you can see that the amount of cultural variation is on the order of 10 times greater than the genetic variation. So there does seem to be a lot more cultural variation between groups than genetic variation. And this doesn't take account of things like institutions that don't show up directly in attitudes. So cooperative behavior is common in tribal groups. We have many examples of it. Food sharing's already been mentioned today, and there are lots of other examples. Warfare, there are real deaths in warfare. And trade is important. Peter Hammerstein remarked that to make trade and economic systems go, you need to have third-party enforcements of contracts. That's a cooperative venture. The state usually organizes that sort of thing and pays judges and so on to implement those kinds of things. So the trade and the division of labor are cooperative enterprises, and the enforcement of moral norms. Probably these things go back a long way. This is evidence of symbolic marking of groups in the Upper Paleolithic, these famous so-called Venus figurines that are stylistically fairly uniform all over the whole of Europe, as if this was one giant ethnic group, giant area, probably not that many people, but this, so the period of time over which this coevolutionary process has gone on could be quite long. So what is the evidence that there are innate social psychological co-evolved mechanisms? The group that was led by Joe Henrich, whose I think name has come up here earlier, he did an ambitious study with a whole slew of co-authors, mostly anthropologists, who studied these 15 different groups, small-scale societies. So they were interested in people's propensities to cooperate across these groups. And they used the ultimatum game, which was devised by a fellow named Werner Guth to do people know the ultimatum game? Most people probably do. So the ultimatum game is that I'm given a sum of money, and I can divide it any way I want with Sarah. And then I make an offer to Sarah, and Sarah, if she's not satisfied with the offer, can say to hell with you, and then neither of us get anything. So this game was devised because the selfish rational optimization argument is very clear about what we should do. Usually there's, for technical reasons, there's a minimum offer I have to make, say 50 cents out of $10. And so if I'm rational and selfish, and I'm confident that Sarah's rational and selfish, I will offer Sarah the minimum, 50 cents, knowing that 50 cents is better than nothing, and Sarah knows this, and she's rational, so she wouldn't throw away 50 cents just to spite me. On the other hand, what people actually do is quite a bit different. So these are mean offers. Philadelphia, Pittsburgh there, rather, is typical of American college students. We heard American college students properly disparaged as experimental subjects by Christoph. And so, but you can see that there are some people who make even higher offers averaging above 50% in the La Malera, and then down to the Quichua and the Machigengan, some groups where the mean offer is 4. Well, excuse me, the quarter of the total, about 25%. And this is the distribution of offers, if you're interested in that. There's almost always a mode at a 50-50 split. And in lots of societies like Pittsburgh, if I were to offer, I don't know exactly what Sarah would take, but I'd be taking my chances with the average American undergraduate if I offered 25% of the stake. It's safest to offer 50%. Hardly anybody rejects 50% offers. Now, again, the prediction is that if people were underneath it all rational and selfish, then at least some societies should show offers of 0 or the minimum, and there don't seem to be any such societies. So this is taken, the argument here is that this is evidence of some kind of instinct for fair play, that humans have a tendency to engage in fair play, albeit with a huge amount of cultural variation from one to the next.